The sun was a hammer on an anvil of red rock. For weeks, it had beaten the Arizona territory flat, baking the life from the grama grass and cracking the earth into a mosaic of thirst. The only movement was the heat rising in shimmering waves from the ground and the slow, agonizing crawl of the wagon train. From her seat on the lead wagon, Eliza Whitford watched the dust kicked up by the oxen hang in the dead air, a pale ghost that followed them from Missouri. It coated her tongue, settled in the lines of her face, and turned her gray traveling dress the color of the desolate landscape. She was a young widow, an orphan before that, and now a seeker. Somewhere in this unforgiving expanse was her brother, Thomas, swallowed by the promise of silver and silence. The trail wound into a narrow canyon, the rock walls offering a sliver of shade that did little to cool the air. The silence here was different. It was heavy, watchful. The creak of the wagon wheels and the lowing of the oxen seemed an intrusion, a foolish noise in a place that demanded reverence. The outriders, who had been lazily scanning the horizon, now sat straighter in their saddles, their hands closer to their rifles. Eliza felt a prickling on her skin that had nothing to do with the heat. She had learned to read the land in the months it had taken to get this far, and the land was holding its breath. The first shot was a sharp crack that echoed off the canyon walls, indistinguishable for a moment from a falling rock. Then a driver screamed, a raw, terrible sound that was cut short. Chaos erupted. Men shouted, horses whinnied in terror, and the air filled with the deafening roar of gunfire. The wagon lurched violently as the oxen panicked. Eliza was thrown, hitting the hard-packed earth with a force that drove the wind from her lungs. She scrambled behind a cluster of boulders, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. She could see them now, not shadows on the rimrock, but men on foot, their faces smudged with dirt, their eyes hard and greedy. They were white men, rough and bearded, moving with a brutal efficiency, shooting drivers and cutting horses loose. This was not a raid for supplies. It was a slaughter for whatever lay in the strong box of the freight wagon. A man fell not 10 feet from her, his chest a bloom of red. Another tried to make a stand and was cut down from 2 directions. It was over in minutes. The survivors were few, huddled and silent as the bandits ransacked the wagons, their laughter coarse and ugly in the sudden quiet. One of them spotted her. He grinned, showing broken teeth, and started toward her, holstering his pistol as if the threat was over and the sport was about to begin. Eliza fumbled in her reticule, her fingers closing around the cold, heavy steel of the pistol her late husband had insisted she carry. She had never fired it. Her hand trembled as she raised it. Then a shadow detached itself from the rocks above. It was not a man dropping down so much as the landscape itself shifting, resolving into a human form. He moved with a liquid grace that was both silent and terrifying. He was Apache, his skin the color of the red earth, his black hair held back by a simple band. He carried a rifle, but held it loosely, a tool he was comfortable with but not defined by. The bandit who had been walking toward Eliza stopped, his grin vanishing. He reached for his gun, a fatal hesitation. The Apache warrior was on him in 3 silent strides. There was no grand struggle. A knife flashed. The bandit crumpled. The other outlaws turned, their confident brutality shattered by this sudden, silent death. They saw the lone figure standing over their fallen comrade, his expression unreadable, a promise of violence in his stillness. He raised his rifle, not to his shoulder, but just enough to be a statement. Another warrior appeared on the rocks above, then a third. They were ghosts called from the stone. The bandits exchanged panicked glances. They had what they came for. They grabbed the strongbox and fled, scrambling back down the canyon the way they had come, their retreat as chaotic as their attack had been organized. The silence that returned was profound, broken only by the whimpering of a wounded man and the buzzing of flies. The Apache warrior looked at Eliza. His gaze was dark and intense, taking in her disheveled state, the pistol still clutched in her white-knuckled hand. He gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod, then turned and melted back into the rocks as silently as he had appeared. The others were gone too. It was as if they had never been there, save for the dead bandit at her feet. Eliza finally let out the breath she had been holding, her body shaking with a violent tremor. Garnet Ridge was less a town than an open wound on the land, a raw collection of clapboard buildings and tents that had sprung up around the promise of the new silver mine. Dust from the street, fine as flour, coated everything. The telegraph poles, stark and new, marched across the landscape, their single wire a thin thread of progress in a vast wilderness. By the time Eliza and the other survivors limped into town, the story had already arrived, twisted and deformed. It was an Apache attack. The whispers said, a massacre. The fear in the town was a palpable thing, thick and suffocating. Deputy Cole Avery met them in front of the sheriff's office, which was little more than a shack with a barred window. He was a man whose ambition was poorly concealed beneath a veneer of folksy charm. His smile was wide, but it never reached his pale, watchful eyes. He listened to the babble of the survivors, nodding sympathetically, his hand resting on the polished handle of his Colt. His eyes found Eliza, who stood apart from the others, her face set in a mask of grim composure. He sauntered over, his spurs ringing softly on the boardwalk. He said her name, his voice full of practiced concern. He asked her to tell him what happened. He wanted to hear it from her. She told him. Her voice was low and steady, recounting the ambush, the brutality, the faces of the men. She told him they were white men. Avery's smile tightened. "That is not what the others are saying," he said, gesturing to the frightened group. "They say it was Indians, Apaches. They are mistaken," Eliza replied, her chin lifting. "They were scared. It happened fast. The men who attacked us were white." The deputy's eyes narrowed. He was about to press her when a commotion arose from the end of the street. Two men were dragging a figure between them. It was the Apache warrior who had saved her. His hands were bound behind his back, but he walked with a straight-backed dignity that made his captors look small and crude. A rifle was shoved into his back. Avery's face lit with a cold satisfaction. He turned to the growing crowd. "See," he boomed, his voice carrying across the dusty street. "We got one of them. This savage and his friends thought they could ambush decent folk." He strode over to the captive, looking him up and down with contempt. The Apache, whose name was Nantan, met his gaze without flinching, his expression a wall of stone. Cole Avery turned back to Eliza, his smile now one of triumphant certainty. "You must have been mistaken in the confusion, ma'am," he said smoothly. "It is a common thing. This is one of the devils that attacked your party. All you have to do is say the word." The town was silent, all eyes on her. She could feel the weight of their fear, their need for a simple answer, a simple villain. It would be so easy to agree, to let the current carry her. It would be safe. But then she saw the image of the dead driver, his eyes wide with surprise, and the dead bandit, his face a mask of avarice. And she saw Nantan, a shadow moving with purpose, a silent arbiter in the canyon. She looked directly at Deputy Avery. His eyes held a warning. "Agree with me?" They said, "Be smart." "No," she said, her voice clear and carrying in the hush. "That is not one of the men who attacked us." A murmur went through the crowd. Avery's face darkened. "Ma'am," he said, his voice losing its folksy charm and taking on a hard edge. "Perhaps you should think carefully. This is Nantan, a Chiricahua. He has scouted for the army, but his kind are not to be trusted. He was found near the canyon." "I do not need to think carefully." "Deputy," Eliza stated, her voice unwavering, "I know what I saw. The men who attacked the wagon train were white. This man," she gestured toward Nantan, "drove them off. He saved my life." Avery stared at her, his jaw working. The crowd began to mutter, their anger and fear now mixed with confusion. They looked from Eliza's resolute face to Nantan's impassive one. The deputy had given them a simple story. and she had just torn it to pieces. He leaned in close, his voice a low hiss meant only for her. "You are making a terrible mistake. People in this town want justice. They do not take kindly to Indian lovers." Eliza met his gaze, her own eyes as hard as flint. She was a widow, an orphan, a woman alone in a land that did not want her. She had nothing left to lose but the truth. "I do not shoot the man who saved me. Deputy Avery," she said, her words a quiet declaration of war. "That is not justice. That is a lie." Cole Avery straightened up, his face a thundercloud. He looked at Nantan, then back at Eliza, and in his eyes she saw not the pursuit of justice, but the frustration of a plan gone awry. He barked an order to his men. "Lock him up. We will sort this out." As they shoved Nantan toward the jail, his eyes met Eliza's for a fleeting second. There was no gratitude in them, no warmth. There was only a quiet, solemn acknowledgement. A debt had been created in the dust and blood of the canyon, and in the suspicious, hostile heart of Garnet Ridge. They were now bound together, two solitary figures against a gathering storm. The sun dipped below the jagged peaks of the Red Mesa, bathing the town in a bloody light, a promise of the days to come. Garnet Ridge was a town running a fever, and the sickness was silver. The promise of it hummed in the air, a frantic energy that came from the constant hammering at the new minehead and the thirsty shouts from the saloons. The Red Mesa, a long, sleeping giant of a mountain range, watched over the town, its stone face impassive to the frantic scrabbling below. But the mountain was now an obstacle. Mr. Pike, a man whose soft hands and expensive suit seemed out of place in the grit, was the owner of the mine. He saw the Red Mesa not as a landmark of ancient power, but as a barrier to profit. A road needed to be cut through its foothills, a direct line to the railroad. And the Apache people who called that land home were an inconvenience. Deputy Cole Avery was Pike's shadow, turning the mine owner's greed into the town's will. He spoke of progress and safety, but his eyes held the cold gleam of a man counting unearned coins. The Apache were the perfect scapegoat, a ready-made fear to be stoked and manipulated. The quiet talk in the saloons, fueled by Pike's whiskey and Avery's whispers, was of relocation, of clearing the way for the important business of getting rich. For Eliza Whitford, the town's fever was a cold chill. Her testimony had made her an outcast. The women of the town pulled their skirts aside when she passed, their faces masks of pious disapproval. The men looked at her with a mixture of suspicion and a crude curiosity that was just as insulting. She was the woman who had spoken for a savage. Work was scarce, and her savings, meager to begin with, were dwindling. Survival, as it had been so many times in her life, was a simple, brutal equation of food and shelter. Her salvation came in the form of a small, dusty building with a single wire running from its roof into the vast, empty sky. The telegraph office, the station agent, a man named Silas Croft, was old and his hands were gnarled with arthritis. The delicate, rapid firework of the key a daily torment. He was overwhelmed by the flood of messages coming in and out of Garnet Ridge, transmissions about supplies, mining equipment, and the private affairs of ambitious men. Eliza walked in one morning, her spine straight, her gaze direct, and offered her services. She had learned the Morse code back in Missouri, her nimble fingers a natural fit for the clattering key. Silas, desperate for help and secretly weary of the town's mob mentality, hired her on the spot for a pittance. The telegraph office became her sanctuary. The rhythmic chatter of the sounder was a language she understood. A conversation of clicks and silences that was more honest than the words spoken on the street. She was a swift and accurate operator, and soon Silas entrusted her with transcribing most of the incoming traffic. She became the town's unwilling confessor, her ears privy to its secrets, its deals, and its lies. She learned of land claims filed in distant offices, of anxious queries from investors, and of the coded, carefully worded messages that passed between Pike and his partners. One afternoon, a message came through that made her pause. her pencil hovering over the pad. It was short, and not in any commercial code she recognized. Night Hall, Hummingbird. No ledger. It was a fragment, a whisper on the wire. But it felt heavy, illicit. She wrote it down on a separate slip of paper and tucked it into the pocket of her dress, a strange sense of foreboding settling over her. The next day, Cole Avery made his move. He strode into the sheriff's office with a new warrant, his voice loud for the benefit of anyone listening. The charge was assault, claiming that Nantan had used excessive force against the bandits in the canyon. It was a flimsy pretext, a legal maneuver designed to put Nantan back in a cage where he could be more easily blamed for whatever Avery and Pike were planning. The town's judge, a circuit magistrate named Hale, was due to arrive in 2 days. Avery intended to have a conviction before the judge could even properly hear the case. Eliza heard the news from Martha Webb, the widow who ran the dairy farm and one of the few people in town who still met her gaze with kindness. Martha's face was grim. "He is just trying to wear you down," she told Eliza. "He thinks if he keeps the Indian locked up, you will lose heart and change your story." But Eliza had the telegraph. That night, working late, she intercepted a message from Pike to Avery. "Handle the native problem before the surveyors arrive." It was the missing piece, the clear and undeniable link between Nantan's persecution and the mine's ambition. This was not about a dead bandit in a canyon. It was about land. It was about the Red Mesa. She knew what she had to do. The risk was enormous. She could be fired, or worse, run out of town. But the image of Nantan's face, his silent dignity as he was led away, had imprinted itself on her mind. The debt between them was not just his. It was hers as well. She had a duty to the truth. When Judge Hale arrived, a weary, gray-haired man who had seen too much of the frontier's rough justice, Eliza was waiting for him. She presented him with a transcribed message, her hand steady, her voice calm as she explained its context. The judge read the slip of paper. His brow furrowed. He looked at her over the rim of his spectacles, his eyes sharp and assessing. "This is a serious accusation," he said. "It is a serious matter," she replied. "An innocent man is in jail so that a rich man can build a road." Judge Hale called a hearing in the saloon, the only building large enough to hold the crowd. He sat at a poker table, the makeshift bench. Cole Avery stood before him, smug and confident, presenting his case with theatrical outrage. Nantan stood beside him, silent and motionless, his gaze fixed on some distant point beyond the room's grimy walls. When Eliza presented her evidence, a hush fell over the room. Avery's face turned a mottled red. He denied everything, calling the message a forgery, a fabrication by a woman with a twisted affection for a killer. But Judge Hale was not a man easily swayed by bluster. He looked at the message, then at Pike, who was attempting to look inconspicuous in the crowd, and then at Avery's furious face. He saw the threads of a conspiracy. He declared there was insufficient evidence to hold Nantan on the new charge and that the original matter of the ambush required further investigation. He ordered Nantan released. Nantan did not wait for the crowd to disperse. He walked out of the saloon and into the fading light, moving with the unhurried purpose of a man who belonged to the open spaces, not to the cramped confines of a town. Later that evening, Eliza found him standing near the edge of town, looking out at the silhouette of the Red Mesa against the star-strewn sky. He turned as she approached, his senses so attuned to the world that her soft footsteps were as loud as a drum. He did not speak, but simply watched her, his expression unreadable. "You took a great risk," he said finally, his voice a low rumble. "You took one for me," she answered. He considered this for a moment. "They stand against you now," he said. "Not just the one in the shiny boots. All of them." "I am aware." She paused. "I need to ask you something. That message I heard, the one about the night hall, it mentioned a place, Hummingbird. Do you know it?" He nodded slowly. "A canyon, not far from here. An old trail. Dangerous. It is how they are moving the silver, she said, the realization dawning on her. The shipments that are not on the books. That is what this is all about. The ambush was to get a strongbox that was never officially there. He looked at her, a new understanding in his eyes. He saw not just a fragile woman from the east, but someone with a keen mind and a core of steel. She had pieced together the whispers and shadows and found the shape of the truth. She held out her hand, a small piece of charcoal and a scrap of paper in her palm. "Teach me a word," she said. He looked at her hand, then at her face, a flicker of surprise in his dark eyes. "If I am to be the town's ears," she said, a faint, wry smile touching her lips, "I should at least learn to read a few of the letters everyone is so fond of. It might be useful." He took the charcoal. On the paper, he drew the block letters of the alphabet. He pointed to each one, speaking its name in a low, patient voice. She repeated them, her brow furrowed in concentration. When they were done, she looked up at him. "Thank you," she said. He met her gaze, his own expression somber, devoid of any sentimentality. The humor that surfaced was as dry as the desert air, and as sharp as a shard of rock. "I learned quickly," Nantan said, "when the words are used to steal my land." The sky had been a pale, washed-out blue for so long that no one remembered what a real cloud looked like. But on this day, a yellow haze appeared on the western horizon, a stain that bled upward, turning the afternoon light a sickly, ominous color. The air grew still and heavy, charged with a strange energy. In the telegraph office, the silence between messages seemed to stretch, filled with an unspoken tension. Eliza, having finished her duties, decided to walk the few miles to Martha Webb's dairy farm, craving a moment of kindness and a glass of cool buttermilk. Her visit with Martha was a small balm on her frayed nerves. They spoke of cows and butter churns, of the unrelenting heat, and of anything but the simmering hostility of Garnet Ridge. But as Eliza started her walk back, the sky had transformed. The yellow haze had become a roiling, brown wall that devoured the horizon. The wind, which had been so still, began to whisper, then moan, rustling her skirts and whipping strands of hair across her face. She quickened her pace, a knot of anxiety tightening in her stomach. The prairie, so open and vast, suddenly felt like a trap. She was halfway to town when the storm hit. It was not a gentle rising of the wind, but a physical blow. A solid wall of dust and sand that struck her with the force of a locomotive. The world vanished. The sun was gone. The red mesa was gone. The town was gone. There was only the screaming wind and the blinding, choking brown. She pulled her shawl over her head, bent double, and tried to keep moving in what she hoped was the right direction. The dust was a thick paste in her mouth and a fire in her lungs. Every breath was an agony of grit. Disoriented and terrified, she stumbled, her ankle twisting painfully. She fell to her knees. Lost. A hand clamped down on her arm. She cried out, a sound stolen by the wind, and tried to pull away, her pistol forgotten in the chaos. The grip was firm, unyielding. A figure loomed over her, a silhouette in the swirling maelstrom. It was Nantan. He had wrapped a strip of cloth over his nose and mouth, but his eyes were clear, steady, and focused. He did not speak. He simply pulled her to her feet, took her arm, and placed it on his own. Then he turned and began to walk, leading her into the brown hell as if he had a compass in his soul. He moved with an economy of motion, his feet seeming to know the unseen ground beneath them. For Eliza, it was a blind agony, a stumbling journey through a nightmare. She clung to his arm, the solid, living presence of him the only thing that kept her from surrendering to the howling void. After an eternity, the ground began to rise. A dark shape loomed out of the dust, a low, solid structure. It was a small cabin, built of river stone and mud chinking, hunkered down against the land as if it had grown there. He pushed open the heavy wooden door, shoved her inside, and then followed, sealing the door behind them. The sudden silence was as shocking as the previous roar. The wind still howled outside, a mournful beast clawing at the walls. But inside, the world was reduced to a small, dim space. A tiny fire smoldered in a stone hearth, casting a flickering, warm light. The cabin was sparse, almost bare. A bedroll lay neatly in one corner. A few clay pots sat on a rough-hewn shelf. There were no decorations, no comforts, only the essentials for a life stripped down to its core. This was his place, his sanctuary. She had crossed a threshold into a world that Garnet Ridge could not comprehend. Nantan removed the cloth from his face and went to a large clay jug in the corner. He poured water into a tin cup and handed it to her. She drank, the water tasting of earth and life, rinsing the mud from her throat. When she was done, he drank from the same cup. He broke off a piece of cornbread from a small loaf sitting near the hearth and gave it to her. They ate in silence, the simple act of sharing sustenance a communion more profound than any words. Eliza sat on a low stool by the fire, her body aching, her nerves still raw. The storm was a relentless assault on the small cabin. But inside, a fragile peace began to settle. In the flickering light, she watched him. He moved with a quiet purpose, checking the chinking around the door, adding a small piece of wood to the fire. He was a man who wasted nothing, not a movement, not a word. The quiet and the shared ordeal unspooled something inside her. "I had a brother," she said, her voice quiet, almost a whisper. "I came west to find him. His name is Thomas. We lost our parents young. He was all I had. He wrote about a silver strike, about making his fortune." Then the letters stopped. Nantan stopped what he was doing and looked at her. He did not offer empty words of comfort. He simply listened, his attention a rare and total gift. "I am afraid," she admitted, the words tasting like ash. "Afraid he is gone, or afraid of what I might find if he is not." He sat on the floor across the hearth from her, the firelight carving shadows on his face. He looked into the flames for a long moment before he spoke. "I had a sister," he said, his voice low and even, yet carrying a weight of grief that filled the small room. "She was younger than me. She had a laugh that was like the sound of water running over stones. The soldiers came to our camp. They said we were on the wrong land. They were clearing it. There was shouting and smoke. She was small. She was frightened. She ran. A horse is a fast thing." He fell silent. The story was complete. There was no need for more detail. In that shared space of loss, the chasm between their two worlds seemed to shrink. They were no longer a white woman and an Apache warrior. They were just two people who understood the shape of a hole left in a life. A small, sad smile touched Eliza's lips. "Well," she said, her voice laced with a gentle irony, "if you ever need someone to translate the glares of the townspeople, I am an expert." For the first time, she saw a flicker of something in his eyes, a brief glint of humor as dry as the dust outside. He gave a slight nod. "I will remember that." The trust between them was a small, tender shoot in a barren land, but it had taken root. The first sound was a splintering crack. It was not the storm. It was the cabin door shuddering in its frame. Nantan was on his feet in an instant, the rifle in his hands, all traces of warmth gone from his face, replaced by a cold, lethal focus. He motioned for her to get down, to move to the far wall, away from the door. A man's voice, rough and angry, shouted from outside, "We know you are in there. Indian. We saw you drag the woman in. We just want what you took from the canyon. Give it to us, and we will leave you to your squaw." Eliza's blood ran cold. It was the bandits. The door shuddered again, hit by something heavy. They were trying to break it down. Nantan looked at her, his eyes asking a question. She knew what it was. She pulled the pistol from her reticule. her hand surprisingly steady. She was no longer the terrified woman in the canyon. She nodded. He pointed to the small, shuttered window on the wall opposite the door. Then he put a finger to his lips. He moved to the side of the door, flattened against the stone wall. A silent predator. Eliza crept to the window, her heart hammering. She slid the wooden bolt on the shutter as quietly as she could. Outside, the storm was beginning to abate, the wind a sustained howl rather than a scream, the dust thinning to a murky fog. She could make out 3 figures. The men outside, emboldened by the silence, made a concerted rush at the door. It groaned, the wood splitting, but the heavy bar held. Nantan waited. He was a statue of perfect patience. "Now," he whispered. Eliza swung the shutter open and fired her pistol into the air. The shot was a sharp report that cut through the wind's howl. The men outside cursed, startled, spinning around toward the unexpected sound. In that moment of distraction, Nantan kicked the bar from the door and threw it open. He did not step out. He fired from the threshold, the rifle bucking against his shoulder. The shot was not aimed at a man, but at the ground near their feet, sending up a spray of dirt and rock. One of the men yelped and fell back. They were not fighters. They were bullies, faced with 2 guns and a defender who was not afraid. Their courage evaporated. They scrambled back, firing a few wild, panicked shots that went wide. Then they vanished into the swirling dust. Nantan calmly rebarred the door. He turned to Eliza, who was still at the window, the pistol smoking in her hand. The air in the cabin was thick with the smell of gunpowder. Outside, the wind began to die down, its fury spent. A strange, diffused light began to filter through the dust. The storm was passing. The threat was over, for now. They had stood together on the threshold of his home and held the line. The silence that fell between them was no longer one of strangeness or grief, but of a shared and hard-won peace. The world after the storm was raw and scoured. The wind had died, leaving behind a profound silence and an eerie, reddish light. The air, scrubbed clean of its usual dust, smelled of damp earth and creosote. Before they parted, Nantan and Eliza walked the ground around the cabin, their eyes scanning for anything the fleeing bandits might have left behind. It was Nantan who found it, not with his eyes, but with his foot. A small, hard lump, half buried in the mud near where the men had tethered their horses. He knelt and worked it free. It was a clod of earth, knocked loose from a man's boot, but embedded within it, catching the strange light, was a small, jagged piece of rock veined with a telltale blue-gray glint, silver ore. He held it out to her on his open palm. Eliza took it, the stone heavy and cold. It was not just any rock. It had a specific character, a unique crystalline structure she had seen before. She had seen piles of it in the carts rumbling out of the pike mine. The connection was no longer a suspicion whispered on a wire. It was a solid thing she could hold in her hand. The men who had attacked her in the canyon, who had come to the cabin to silence them, were not random drifters. They worked for the mine. Back in Garnet Ridge, the telegraph office felt like the calm center of a storm. The town was a hornet's nest of gossip. Eliza's night in the storm, her rescue by Nantan, had been twisted into something ugly and illicit. She felt the sting of it in the way people turned their heads as she walked down the street, the way their conversations dropped to whispers when she entered the general store. The rumors were Cole Avery's weapon, and he wielded it with a surgical precision, poisoning the well of public opinion until she was utterly isolated. She ignored the whispers and focused on the rhythmic clatter of the key. The words Night Hall and Hummingbird Canyon were burned into her memory, with the piece of ore tucked safely away. The messages took on a terrifying clarity. The mine was running a ghost operation, smuggling untaxed, unrecorded silver through the back country, using bandits as escorts and enforcers. The original ambush had likely been a double cross, a theft of one of these secret shipments, and the outlaws had come to Nantan's cabin believing he had found something they had lost in their haste. The need to find her brother, Thomas, became a burning ache, a counterpoint to the growing danger. She had to know if he was safe, if he was somehow entangled in this web of greed. She began a quiet search, poring over old passenger lists for the stagecoach and asking careful, roundabout questions at the general store about newcomers from Missouri. No one knew the name Whitford. It was as if he had vanished into the territory's vast, hungry maw. One afternoon, a message came for the mine supply master. Silas, his knuckles swollen and painful, asked her to deliver it. It was a short walk to the sprawling, noisy depot at the edge of town, a place of shouting men, braying mules, and the constant clang of iron on stone. As she waited for the foreman, she watched the men loading heavy wooden crates onto a massive freight wagon. Her eyes scanned their faces, a habit born of a hope she was beginning to lose. And then she saw him. He stood on the loading dock, a clipboard in his hand, his back to her. He was thinner than she remembered, the shoulders less broad. But there was a set to them, a way of holding his head that was as familiar to her as her own reflection. He turned to shout an order to one of the teamsters, and her heart seized in her chest. It was Thomas. His face was leaner, tanned by the brutal sun and etched with lines of worry that had not been there before. The boyish charm she remembered was gone, replaced by a hard, weary caution. "Thomas," she breathed, the name a prayer on her lips. She took a step forward. He saw her then. For a second, his face registered a pure, unadulterated shock. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. Then the shock was replaced by something else, something that looked painfully like fear. He glanced around, his eyes darting to the other men, then back to her. He gave a sharp, almost imperceptible shake of his head. He walked quickly toward her, taking her by the elbow and steering her around the corner of the building, out of sight. "Eliza," he said, his voice a harsh whisper. "What in God's name are you doing here?" "Finding you," she said, her own voice trembling with 1,000 unasked questions. "I came to find you. I was so worried." His grip on her elbow tightened. "You cannot be here," he said, his eyes wild with a desperation she did not understand. "You have to leave, now." She looked at him, truly looked at him, and saw the fine sheen of sweat on his brow, the way his gaze refused to meet hers for more than a second. She saw the frayed collar of his shirt and the ink stains on his fingers. He was not a prosperous miner. He was a clerk, a functionary in Pike's machine. "I cannot leave." "Thomas, this is my job. I work at the telegraph office." His face went pale. The telegraph office. He let go of her arm as if he had been burned. "You have to quit. You have to get on the next stagecoach out of this town and never look back. It is not safe for you here." "Why, what is happening here?" she pleaded. "What are you so afraid of?" He finally met her eyes, and in their depths she saw a deep, bottomless shame. "I made some mistakes, Eliza, bad ones. I got into debt, cards, Pike, the man who owns the mine. He owns my debt. I work for him now. I see things. I write things down in his ledgers, things that are not right." He looked away, toward the crates on the loading dock. "He knows everything that happens in this town. He knows who you are." She understood. He was trapped. He was a cog in the very machine she was trying to expose. The joy of finding him curdled into a cold, heavy dread. "So you will not even acknowledge me. You will not stand with your own sister." "It is to protect you," he hissed, his face contorted with a misery that was almost painful to watch. "If they know we are related, they will use you to control me, or they will get rid of you to ensure my silence. Please, Eliza, just be a stranger. It is the only way to keep you safe." He turned and walked away before she could say another word, disappearing back into the noise and dust of the depot, leaving her alone with the ruin of her long search. The encounter left her shaken, her resolve fractured. The fight was no longer a simple matter of justice for a stranger. It was now tangled up with the fate of her lost brother. The weight of it all pressed down on her. The town's hostility, Cole Avery's smug threats, and now Thomas's fear. Avery escalated his campaign. He went to Silas directly, his voice dripping with false concern. He spoke of the sensitive nature of telegraphic communications, of the importance of having an operator who held the town's trust. An operator, he implied, who was not known for spending nights in the wilderness with an Apache. Silas, to his credit, defended her. He told Avery that Eliza was the best operator he had ever had and that her personal life was her own affair. But Eliza saw the worry in the old man's eyes. He was a good man, but he was also a man who depended on his position for his survival. He could not stand against the combined power of Pike and the law for long. The pressure began to wear her down. The shame, which she had held at bay with a righteous anger, began to seep in. She walked through the town feeling like a branded woman, the whispers like tiny, sharp stones thrown at her back. She began to doubt herself. Was she being foolish? Was she sacrificing her own safety? And now, possibly, her brother's. For a principle that this town clearly did not value. What did she really owe Nantan? She had testified for him. The debt was paid. Perhaps Thomas was right. Perhaps the wisest course of action was to simply disappear. One evening, unable to bear the confines of her small boarding house room, she walked out of town, following the trail that led toward the foothills of the Red Mesa. She sat on a boulder as the sun bled across the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple. She felt small and profoundly alone, torn between her loyalty to her brother and her commitment to the truth. She did not hear him approach. He was suddenly just there, a still presence in the vast twilight. Nantan, he stood a respectful distance away, watching her, his face impassive in the gathering gloom. "Their words have found a home in you," he said. It was not a question. She did not have the energy to deny it. "My brother is here," she said, her voice flat with exhaustion. "He works for Pike. He is in trouble. He wants me to leave. The deputy wants me fired. Everyone in that town wishes I would vanish." Maybe they are right. She looked up at him, her eyes pleading for an answer he could not give. He came closer and sat on a nearby rock, not looking at her, but out at the mountain. His mountain. "The wind is a liar sometimes," he said, his voice quiet. "It howls that the cliff is too steep, that the tree has no water. A wise person listens to the stone and the root instead." She did not understand. "Their words are the wind," he explained, his gaze still fixed on the horizon. "They make a lot of noise. They try to push you. They tell you which way you must go. But your path is your own. It is made of what you know to be true, not what they want you to believe." He turned his head and looked at her then, his dark eyes holding hers. "Do not let their words choose your path for you. Eliza Whitford." It was simple. It was profound. He was not telling her to stay or to go. He was not telling her to fight or to run. He was reminding her that the choice was still hers. Despite the pressure, despite the fear, her own will was the one thing they could not touch. He was giving her back to herself. She took a deep breath, the clean, cool air of the high desert filling her lungs. The confusion and fear began to recede, replaced by a cold, hard clarity. To run would be to let them win. It would be to abandon her brother to his fate and to allow a great injustice to fester in the dark. She stood up, her back straight, her chin high. "Thank you," she said. He simply nodded, then rose and walked away, disappearing into the twilight as silently as he had come, leaving her alone with the mountain and her decision. A decision that was no longer a burden, but a weapon. The journey into the Red Mesa was a climb toward the sky. Nantan led Eliza along paths that were not paths at all, but faint suggestions on the rock, routes readable only to one who knew the land's secret language. The air grew thinner, cleaner. The squalor of Garnet Ridge shrank below them, a festering sore on the vast, beautiful body of the desert. Here, the world was stone, wind, and silence. Eliza felt as though she were shedding a skin, leaving behind the woman who was whispered about in town to become simply a person moving through an ancient landscape. She had to place her feet carefully, her hands finding holds on the warm rock. The physical effort focused her, quieting the storm in her mind. The Chiricahua camp was nestled in a hidden valley, a place of unexpected green where a spring trickled from the rock and nourished a grove of cottonwoods. It was a place of life, not of war. The wickiups, fashioned from branches and hides, seemed to grow from the earth itself. The smell of cedar smoke and roasting corn hung in the air. Women looked up from their work, their dark eyes watchful but not hostile. Children stopped their games to stare at the white woman, their curiosity open and unguarded. There was a quiet dignity to the place that made the frantic energy of Garnet Ridge seem foolish and vulgar. Nantan led her to the largest of the shelters. 2 figures sat outside in the shade of a juniper tree. One was a man in his prime, his face a mask of stern authority, his shoulders broad with the weight of leadership. This was Naichi, the chief. The other was a woman so old her face was a beautiful map of wrinkles, her eyes clouded with cataracts but holding a light of fierce intelligence. Her name was Dane, and she was a woman of medicine and wisdom. Nantan spoke to them in their own tongue, his voice a low, respectful cadence. As he spoke, their eyes rested on Eliza. She did not fidget or look away. She stood quietly, her hands clasped before her, and met their gazes with a calm respect. When Nantan finished, Dane beckoned Eliza forward with a slight movement of her hand. The old woman picked up a gourd dipper, filled it with water from a clay pot, and held it out. It was a simple gesture, but Eliza knew it was a test. She walked forward, knelt on the ground before the old woman, and took the dipper in both hands. She drank slowly, deliberately, then handed it back with a small nod of thanks. She had not wiped the rim. She had not hesitated. She had accepted what was offered, on its own terms. A faint, almost imperceptible smile touched Dane's lips. She had seen what she needed to see. Through Nantan's translation, Eliza told them what she knew. She spoke of the telegraph messages, of the hidden canyon, of the silver ore found on the bandit's boot. Naichi listened, his expression unchanging, but a new sharpness entered his eyes. This was not the familiar story of encroachment and broken treaties. This was a story of a secret war, fought for secret profits, with his people caught in the middle. "We need proof," Eliza said, "something Judge Hale cannot ignore." "The proof is the land itself," Nantan said. He picked up a piece of the soft, red sandstone that gave the mesa its name. He crushed it in his hand, leaving a streak of vibrant red powder on his palm. "The wagons they use are heavy. They leave deep tracks. We find their route through Hummingbird Canyon. I will mark the trail with this powder, a line that even a white man's eyes cannot miss, a trail that leads from the canyon right to Pike's mine." It was a simple, elegant plan, using their own earth as a witness. "But someone must bring the judge," Eliza said. "I cannot be seen riding out to meet him. They watch me too closely now." "Martha Webb," Nantan said. "She is a woman of courage. She has a strong heart." Eliza agreed. Martha was their only true ally. They finalized the plan. Nantan and his warriors would track the next night haul. After they marked the trail, Eliza would send a coded message to a trusted operator in the next county, a message for Martha to collect and deliver by hand to Judge Hale, summoning him to Garnet Ridge on an urgent pretext. It was a fragile chain of trust, but it was all they had. While this fragile alliance was being forged in the high country, a trap was being laid in the town below. Cole Avery found Thomas Whitford at the mine depot, sorting through freight manifests. The deputy did not waste time with pleasantries. He backed Thomas against a stack of crates, his body blocking him from view, his voice a low, menacing purr. "Your sister is a fool," Avery began. "She is up in the hills with the Apache right now, playing with fire." A cold fear gripped Thomas. "What do you want?" "I want a story," Avery said, "a simple one. A few of Pike's prospectors were checking a claim up near the foothills. They got run off by Apaches. They saw them clear as day. A war party, And you were up there, checking on a supply mule. You saw it too. You saw Nantan leading them." "That is a lie," Thomas whispered, his mouth dry. "I was not there." Avery smiled. "A cold, dead thing. You are now." He leaned closer, his breath sour. "Pike is tired of this. He is ready to clear his accounts. One way or another. Your gambling debt is a big one. Thomas, big enough to see you in a territorial prison for a very long time. Or it could just disappear. And your sister, a woman who spends her time with savages in a town that is about to boil over. Well, her health might be at risk. Accidents happen." The threat was clear. A blade pressed against the two things Thomas cared about most, his freedom and his sister's life. He looked into Avery's merciless eyes and saw no room for negotiation. He felt the weight of his own weakness, the shame of his mistakes, crushing him. He sagged against the crates. "I will do it," he said, the words tasting like poison. "Good man," Avery said, slapping him on the shoulder. "You just saved your sister's life." The next afternoon, two terrified prospectors, their faces artfully smudged with dirt and their clothes torn, stumbled into Garnet Ridge, babbling about an unprovoked attack. They had been scouting a new claim when a band of Apache warriors, led by Nantan, had charged them, firing rifles and screaming threats. They had barely escaped with their lives. Thomas Whitford, pale and trembling, corroborated their story. The town exploded. The simmering resentment and fear that Avery had so carefully cultivated now burst into open flame. Men poured out of the saloons, their faces flushed with whiskey and rage. Pike stood on the hotel balcony, calling for action, for the protection of their livelihood. Cole Avery took center stage in the dusty street, his voice ringing with authority and outrage. He called for a posse, a volunteer militia to ride to the Red Mesa and deliver justice. He spoke of women and children, of the sanctity of their homes, of the savage threat looming in the hills. It was a masterful performance, and the town, primed for violence, roared its approval. Martha Webb heard the commotion from her dairy. She ran into town and saw the mob forming, the men checking their rifles, the torchlight glinting on their angry faces. Her heart turned to ice. She found Eliza in the telegraph office, calmly transcribing a shipping order, the small building an island of order in the rising sea of chaos. "They are going to kill them," Martha said, her voice breathless with panic. "They are forming a posse. Avery is leading it. They say Nantan attacked some miners. Thomas, your brother—" He backed the story. "They ride at dawn." Eliza felt the floor drop out from under her. Thomas. He had not just surrendered. He had become their weapon. The ash of betrayal settled in her heart. She looked out the window. The sun was setting, and the light of the torches in the street seemed to be setting the whole town on fire. She could hear their voices, a single, unified roar of hate. The eastbound stagecoach was due in the morning. She could be on it. She could be gone before the posse even cleared the town limits. She could leave this all behind. Leave Thomas to his shame and Nantan to his fate. It was the sensible thing to do. It was the safe thing to do. It was what her brother, in his own twisted way, had wanted for her. She looked at Martha's frightened face. She thought of Nantan's quiet strength, of Da Nai's wise eyes. She thought of the little girl with the bright, curious gaze in the Apache camp. The clatter of the telegraph sounder beside her seemed to be tapping out a question, over and over again. She was the only one who could send a warning. She was the bridge, however fragile, between two worlds, and one of those worlds was about to be burned to the ground. The choice was no longer a matter of her own survival. It was a matter of her soul. To leave now would be to let the fire consume everything. To stay, to act, was to walk directly into the heart of the flames. The torches in the street threw dancing, monstrous shadows against the clapboard buildings, and the collective voice of the mob was a low, guttural growl. The air in the telegraph office was thick with the smell of hot metal and ozone, a stark contrast to the scent of whiskey and bloodlust outside. Eliza looked at Martha Webb's terrified face, then at the orderly rows of equipment in her small office. Her world had been reduced to this single, stark choice: the eastbound stagecoach or the fire. "There is no time to warn them," Martha said, her hands twisting the fabric of her apron. "The posse will be a dozen armed men. Nantan and his people will be slaughtered." "A warning is not what they need," Eliza said, a sudden, cold clarity cutting through her fear. "They need a shield. They need the law. Judge Hale is in Prescott. If we ride now, we can reach him by morning." "Ride?" Martha's eyes widened. "Through the night with that mob out there." "The mob is not looking for two women on a dairy wagon," Eliza countered, her mind racing, fitting the pieces together. "They are looking toward the Red Mesa. We will go the other way. We will go around them." The decision, once made, settled in her bones like iron. She went to the small chest where she kept her few belongings and took out the piece of silver ore, wrapping it carefully in a handkerchief. Then she took the telegraph office logbook, the thick, leather-bound volume where she had meticulously recorded every message, sent and received. It was all the proof she had. Their departure was a thing of shadows and whispers. Martha brought her wagon, the bed filled with empty milk cans, to the alley behind the telegraph office, under the cover of darkness, with the roar of the mob as a distraction. They slipped out of town, the wagon wheels creaking softly on the dusty track. The ride was a long, tense nightmare. Every shadow seemed to hold a threat. Every gust of wind sounded like a pursuing horse. They did not speak, conserving their energy, their shared purpose a silent bond between them. They found Judge Hale holding court in a Prescott hotel lobby, looking weary and out of place amidst the gaudy wallpaper and velvet chairs. He looked up, his expression one of annoyance at the intrusion, but it softened when he saw the state of them, their faces pale with exhaustion and streaked with dust. Eliza did not waste time with pleasantries. She laid the piece of ore on the polished table between them. "This came from a bandit's boot," she said, her voice low and urgent. "A man who attacked my wagon train, and who later attacked me at the cabin of the man you set free. It is the same ore that comes from Pike's mine." Then she placed the logbook beside it. "And this," she said, her finger tracing the spine, "is a record of every message sent to and from Garnet Ridge for the last 2 months. It contains coded orders for night hauls of unrecorded silver, and a direct message from Mr. Pike to Deputy Avery, telling him to handle the native problem before the land surveyors arrive. A mob is gathering as we speak. Judge, they mean to ride to the Red Mesa at dawn and handle it themselves." Judge Hale picked up the ore. His eyes narrowed in concentration. He looked from the rock to the logbook, then to Eliza's unflinching gaze. Martha stepped forward. "I have known Eliza Whitford since she arrived," Martha said, her voice clear and strong. "She is an honest woman, Judge, and she is a brave one. What she says is the truth. The town has been fed a diet of lies and fear by Cole Avery, and it is about to do something terrible." The judge was silent for a long time, his fingers drumming a soft tattoo on the table. He was one man against a tide of greed and violence. But the law, even a fragile, overworked law, was his only weapon. He sighed, a sound of profound weariness. He pushed himself to his feet. "Get your wagon, ladies," he said. "It seems my work in Garnet Ridge is not yet finished." They arrived back at dawn, a strange trio in a dusty dairy wagon, rolling into town just as Cole Avery was mounting his horse to lead the posse. The sight of the judge, his face grim and set, stopped the mob in its tracks. A confused murmur rippled through the men. "There will be no ride this morning," Judge Hale announced, his voice cutting through the tension. "I am convening a formal hearing at noon, here, in the street. We will settle this matter with testimony, not with torches." Avery's face was a mask of fury. He dismounted, his movement stiff with rage, and strode over to the judge. On what grounds, he demanded. On the grounds of conspiracy to defraud the territorial government, inciting a riot, and attempted murder, the judge replied calmly. These are serious charges. Deputy, I suggest you find yourself a lawyer." He then turned to the posse. "Disperse," he commanded. "Go back to your homes. The law is in charge now." The men, their drunken courage evaporating under the cold light of day and the judge's authority, began to shuffle away, their lust for a fight replaced by a grudging confusion. In the commotion, Eliza saw Nantan at the edge of town, a solitary figure who had come down from the hills, drawn by the scent of war. Avery saw him too, his face lit with a malicious triumph. He had lost the mob, but he had another card to play. "That man," Avery shouted, pointing at Nantan, "is the cause of this. He is an agitator, a rebel. I am arresting him for inciting this violence." He motioned to two of his men, who moved hesitantly toward Nantan. Nantan did not resist. He stood, straight and proud, as they bound his hands, his eyes fixed on Eliza. It was a calculated move by Avery. He was taking Nantan off the board, isolating Eliza, and challenging the judge's authority all at once. Later that morning, Avery came to the telegraph office. He told Silas Croft that the logbook was now official evidence, and he was confiscating it for the hearing. Silas, a man who bent before any strong wind, could only nod and step aside. Avery took the logbook, and with a smirk at Eliza, he walked out. She knew, with a sickening certainty, that the book Judge Hale would see would not be the one she had kept. Her proof was gone. Despair, cold and absolute, washed over her. She had played her hand, and it had not been enough. She stood by the window, watching the town prepare for the hearing, a grim parody of justice. Then she saw him. Thomas. He was walking down the opposite side of the street, his head down, trying to be invisible. He glanced up, his eyes meeting hers for a fraction of a second. He gave a tiny, almost imperceptible nod toward the alley beside her building, then looked away and kept walking. Her heart pounded. A few minutes later, her hands trembling, she slipped out the back door. He was there, huddled in the shadows between the buildings. His face was pale, his eyes shot with guilt. He did not speak. He simply pushed a small, tightly wound spool of paper tape into her hand. It was a telegraph ribbon, the long, thin strip of paper with its endless line of embossed dots and dashes. "I am sorry." "Eliza," he whispered, his voice cracking. "I was a coward. I made a copy before he could see." He looked at her, his eyes pleading for a forgiveness he did not deserve. "Be careful." He was gone before she could reply, melting back into the life he was trapped in. She looked down at the ribbon in her hand. It was the original record, the language of the wire itself. It was the truth, undeniable and pure, and it was her only hope. Night fell. The first rains of the season began to fall. Not a downpour, but a steady, soaking drizzle that turned the dust of the streets to a thick, red mud. The air grew cold. The hearing was hours away, consumed by a nervous energy. Eliza left her boarding house, needing to walk, to think. She pulled her shawl tight around her shoulders and headed for the wooden bridge at the edge of town that crossed the arroyo. The rain was falling harder now, and the gentle trickle of water in the dry creek bed was becoming a steady, growing murmur. She stood in the middle of the bridge, the rain plastering her hair to her face, and listened to the rising voice of the water. She did not hear the footsteps on the muddy bank behind her. There were 3 of them, the same men from the canyon, the same men from the cabin. Their faces were grim in the lantern light, their intentions brutally clear. Cole had sent them to finish the job. "The lady needs to take a little trip," one of them said, his voice a low growl. "Away from the hearing." They lunged for her. She screamed, a sound swallowed by the rain and the rising roar of the creek. She tried to run, but the wet planks were slick. One of them grabbed her arm. Then, out of the darkness, a shape moved with impossible speed. Nantan. He must have been released, or he had escaped. He was on them in a flash, a silent, deadly force. He moved not like a man fighting, but like a force of nature. One of the bandits went down with a choked cry. Another pulled a knife. The fight was a desperate, slipping ballet of violence on the narrow bridge. Below them, the arroyo was no longer a creek. It was a flash flood. A raging torrent of brown water filled with debris, tearing at the bridge's wooden pilings. Nantan, seeing the second man coming at him with the knife, did not meet him head-on. Instead, he spun and threw his weight against the thick hemp rope that served as the bridge's railing, shoving the bandit off balance. The man screamed as he toppled over the side and was instantly swallowed by the flood. The third man, seeing his companion vanish, panicked. He pulled a pistol, but before he could aim, Nantan kicked one of the main support posts. The wood, weakened by the flood, splintered with a sharp crack. The entire bridge shuddered violently, tilting at a precarious angle. The bandit lost his footing and slid down the slick planks, his pistol flying from his hand. He hit the water and was gone. But the bridge was breaking apart. Eliza screamed as the section she was on gave way, plunging her into the churning, icy water. The current seized her, dragging her under. For a moment, there was only a chaos of roaring water and tumbling blackness. Then a hand seized the collar of her dress, pulling her head above the surface. It was Nantan. He had her, his arm hooked around a splintered beam that was still connected to the bank. The water tore at them, trying to rip them away. But he held on, his muscles straining, his face a mask of fierce determination. He held them both against the flood, two survivors clinging to the wreckage in the heart of the storm. The journey from the shattered bridge back to the cabin was a passage through a cold, liquid hell. The rain had lessened its fury but had not ceased, falling in a steady, chilling drizzle that leached the last of their strength. The world was a formless chaos of mud, slick rock, and darkness. Eliza moved as if in a dream, her body a numb, shivering machine that functioned only because of the unyielding hand that held her arm. Nantan guided them, his own movements weary but certain, his knowledge of the terrain a sixth sense that operated beyond sight. He was half supporting her, his strength a bulwark against the violent tremors that racked her frame. She did not know how long they walked. Time had dissolved into the rhythm of her chattering teeth and the squelch of their boots in the deep mud. When the dark, low shape of the cabin finally emerged from the gloom, it felt less like a building and more like a piece of the earth offering sanctuary. Nantan pushed the heavy door open, and the breath of warm, dry air that met them was the most profound luxury Eliza had ever known. He led her inside and barred the door, shutting out the wet, hostile world. The small space was lit by the deep, orange glow of the embers in the hearth. The fire had been banked carefully and had survived their absence. A small, stubborn heart of warmth in the cold night. The silence within the stone walls was absolute, a stark contrast to the memory of the roaring flood and the hiss of the rain. It was a silence that amplified the sound of their own ragged breathing and the violent shivering that still consumed them. They stood for a moment, dripping onto the packed earth floor. Two survivors washed up on a desolate shore. Eliza's sodden dress felt as heavy as a shroud, and a cold deeper than the floodwater had settled into her bones. She could not stop shaking. Nantan moved without a word. He took a thick wool blanket from his bedroll and draped it around her shoulders. Then he turned his back, a gesture of profound and simple respect, and began to strip off his own soaked buckskin shirt. His back, illuminated by the firelight, was a landscape of lean, hard muscle, scarred in a way that spoke of a life of conflict and survival. He pulled on a dry shirt and then turned back to her. "Your dress," he said, his voice low and practical. "You must get out of it. The cold will take you." Her fingers were numb, useless. She fumbled with the buttons on her bodice, but they would not yield. She looked at him, her eyes wide with a helpless frustration. He came forward, and with a surprisingly gentle touch, his calloused fingers worked the small buttons free. He did not look at her body, but kept his gaze fixed on his task, his expression one of pure, focused concern. He helped her peel the wet, heavy layers away until she stood in her chemise and drawers. Then he wrapped the blanket tightly around her, tucking it in until she was fully cocooned. He took her wet clothes and hung them near the hearth, the water dripping from them with a soft hiss as it hit the warm stones. He then tended to the fire, adding small, dry pieces of juniper. The wood caught quickly, and small flames began to dance over the glowing coals, pushing back the shadows and filling the cabin with a clean, sharp scent. He fetched 2 tin cups and filled them with water, and they drank in silence. The simple act a shared ritual against the encroaching darkness. They huddled on the floor before the hearth, Eliza enveloped in her blanket, Nantan with another draped over his own shoulders. The fire began to work its magic, a slow, creeping warmth that fought its way toward the deep chill within them. The shivering lessened, but the aftermath of terror remained, a vibration in the air, a memory of the roaring water and the lurch of the collapsing bridge. They had been seconds from death, and the knowledge of it sat between them, a silent, powerful presence. Eliza looked at him, at his strong, calm profile outlined by the firelight. He had appeared from the darkness like a ghost, a guardian. He had fought for her. He had held her against the killing current. The debts between them had become a tangled, unbreakable cord. He was no longer just the man she had defended. He was the man who had become her shield. An overwhelming wave of emotion washed over her, a mix of gratitude, terror, and a profound, aching need for the simple certainty of his presence. She shifted closer to him, drawn by the solid warmth he radiated. The space between them disappeared. She leaned her head forward until her forehead rested against the coarse fabric of his dry shirt, against the steady, living beat of his heart. The contact was a grounding force, an anchor in the swirling chaos of her mind. He did not move, did not react, but simply allowed her the comfort of his stillness. "Press into me," she whispered, the words a faint breath against his chest. It was not a request, but a plea for him to be real, to be solid, to hold back the memory of the black, churning water. He responded without hesitation. His arm came around her, pulling her from her own separate space into his. He shifted, turning his body to fully enclose hers, his other arm coming around her back until she was held fast against him. "Always," he answered, his voice a low, certain rumble that vibrated through her. The embrace was not one of passion, but of solemnity. It was a shelter built of muscle and bone. He held her as if she were something infinitely precious that had been nearly lost, his grip tight with the promise of protection. One of his hands moved, spreading flat against the curve of her lower back, a steady, reassuring pressure that spoke of safety and unwavering support. It was not the touch of a lover, but the touch of a guardian, a promise made flesh. It was the profound, unspoken intimacy of 2 souls who had faced the void together and had chosen to cling to each other. The embrace was a vow, a silent recognition that their paths, once parallel, were now irrevocably intertwined. Here, in the heart of the storm, they had claimed each other, not with words of love, but with a shared will to survive. They stayed that way for a long time, the firelight dancing on the stone walls, the rain outside softening to a gentle, rhythmic patter on the roof. The last of the violent tremors left her body, replaced by a deep, resonant warmth that came not from the fire, but from him. A small, shaky laugh escaped her lips, a bubble of sound in the quiet room. She tilted her head back, looking up at his face. "Did we just make a vow?" she murmured, her voice still husky with emotion. "Or are we just shivering?" He looked down at her, and in the firelight, she saw a rare, faint smile touch the corners of his mouth. It transformed his stern face, revealing a warmth she had only glimpsed before. "Both," he said, "but the promise is warmer." The truth of his words settled deep within her, a comfort more profound than the blanket or the fire. She rested her head against his shoulder, her eyes growing heavy. The exhaustion of the day, of the past weeks, finally washed over her. But it was no longer accompanied by fear. He continued to hold her, his presence a steady, unwavering wall against the night. She felt his breathing, slow and even, a quiet rhythm that lulled her toward sleep. The world outside, with its hearings and its mobs and its lies, seemed a distant, half-forgotten thing. All that was real was the safety of these four walls, the scent of juniper smoke, and the solid, living warmth of the man who held her as if he would never let her go. They returned to Garnet Ridge as the false dawn painted the eastern sky a bruised purple. The rain had passed, leaving the world scoured and weeping, the streets a river of thick, red mud. A heavy silence hung over the town, the exhausted peace that follows a storm. But as they neared the collection of buildings, a different light began to challenge the rising sun, an unnatural, flickering orange that cast writhing shadows against the low clouds. The smell hit them next, the acrid stench of pine and something else, something chemical and wrong, carried on the damp morning air. It was the smell of a fire that was not meant for warmth. The glow was coming from the edge of town, from the sprawling collection of sheds and warehouses that belonged to the Pike Mine, the largest of them. The main storage depot was already a roaring inferno. Flames licked from the windows and chewed through the roof, sending a column of greasy black smoke boiling into the sky. It was not a tragedy. It was an act of war. Cole Avery stood before the blaze, a silhouette against the destruction he had wrought. In his hand, he held a burning torch, and his face, illuminated by the flames, was a mask of manic triumph. He had a small group of his most loyal thugs with him, men whose loyalty was to Pike's coin, not to any law. "It is the Apache," Avery bellowed, his voice carrying over the roar of the fire. "A reprisal. They have come to burn us out. This is what comes of harboring savages." But his audience was not the bloodthirsty mob from the night before. It was a handful of frightened workers, roused from their sleep, their faces pale with shock and fear. They saw the fire not as an act of war, but as the destruction of their livelihoods. "Get buckets!" one of them shouted, his voice raw with panic. "There are men still in the bunkhouse next to the depot." Avery made no move to help. This was his plan, the destruction of the warehouse, with all its incriminating ledgers and records, and the death of a few miners to be laid at Nantan's door, would be the final, bloody masterstroke. Nantan and Eliza arrived at the scene not as a warrior and a telegraph operator, but as two people intent on stemming a tide of chaos. They saw the trapped workers, the spreading flames, and Avery's triumphant inaction. They moved without exchanging a word, their purpose perfectly aligned. As Nantan ran toward the bunkhouse, his powerful form cutting through the smoke, Martha Webb arrived, her face a grim mask of determination. She had seen the glow from her farm and had come at once. She took in the scene, her practical gaze assessing the disorganized panic. "You men," she commanded, her voice cutting through the noise with an authority born of a lifetime of hard work. "Stop gawking and form a line to the water trough. We will not let this whole town burn because one man has lost his mind." Her presence, her simple, unshakable competence, was a grounding force. The miners, desperate for a leader, rallied to her, forming a bucket brigade that began to throw a pitiful but determined stream of water against the encroaching flames. At that moment, Thomas Whitford appeared, running from the direction of the town. His face was ashen. He saw the burning depot, the building where he worked, where he kept the false ledgers, and he saw his sister standing near the heart of the danger. The last of his cowardice burned away in the searing heat. He ran to Eliza's side. "The ledgers," he gasped, choking on the smoke. "The real ones. Pike keeps a secret set. They're in a firebox in the foreman's office. That whole building will go up in minutes." "Then help them," Eliza said, her voice sharp, pointing toward the bunkhouse where Nantan was now pulling a dazed and coughing man from a window. Thomas did not hesitate. He plunged into the chaos, his knowledge of the depot's layout a sudden, vital asset. He guided men away from a collapsing wall, showed them a back entrance to the bunkhouse, and worked with a frantic energy, the fire a crucible that was burning away his shame. Eliza watched the scene, a tableau of desperate heroism and calculated evil. The bucket brigade was too small. The fire was too big. Avery was simply watching, waiting for the destruction to be complete. And Judge Hale, their only legal shield, was asleep in his hotel room, unaware. She knew then that buckets of water would not be enough to win this fight. She needed a flood. She turned and ran, not toward the fire, but away from it, her muddy skirts flying. She ran toward the telegraph office. The door was locked. Without a thought, she picked up a large rock and smashed the window, ignoring the sting of the glass as she reached inside and unlatched the door. Her office was a quiet, orderly sanctuary amidst the bedlam. She sat at her station, her fingers finding the key as if by instinct. The relay to the county seat in Prescott was her only hope. Her fingers began to move, the clatter of the key a frantic, desperate heartbeat in the quiet room. She did not use complex codes. She sent the truth in plain, urgent language. Conspiracy and arson in Garnet Ridge. Pike Mine warehouse burning. Deputy Avery involved. Judge Hale in danger. Immediate assistance required. She sent the message again, and then a third time, praying that a competent operator was on the other end, praying that they would understand the urgency, that they would act. She had just finished when the door was kicked open. Cole Avery stood there, his face black with soot and fury. He had seen her run, had guessed her purpose. The game was over. The telegraph was a witness he could not silence. "You clever little fool," he snarled. "You have just signed your own death warrant." He lunged for her, grabbing her by the arm and dragging her from the chair. He pulled her out into the muddy street, his fingers digging into her flesh like talons. He was no longer a deputy. He was a cornered animal, acting on pure, violent instinct. He dragged her through the chaotic scene, past the firefighters, past her brother, who shouted her name in a strangled cry. He dragged her toward the only escape route he could imagine, the rebuilt bridge over the arroyo. The bridge was a hasty, rough affair, built to replace the one destroyed in the flood. The waters below had receded, but were still a swift, muddy current. He shoved her ahead of him onto the planks, pulling his pistol. Nantan saw them. He had just pulled the last man from the bunkhouse. He turned and saw Avery dragging Eliza to the bridge, the glint of the pistol in his hand. He began to run, his long legs eating up the ground. Avery saw him coming. He put the barrel of the pistol to Eliza's temple. "Stay back," he screamed, his voice cracking with desperation, "or I will kill her." Nantan stopped at the edge of the bridge. He was 100 feet away. He had his rifle, but the shot was impossible. Eliza was in the way, and his target was a moving, desperate man. "You lose," Avery spat, his eyes wild. "All of you." Nantan slowly raised his rifle to his shoulder. He took a breath. Avery laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. He thought Nantan was aiming for him, a shot he would never risk. But Nantan was not looking at Avery. His gaze was fixed slightly to the left, on the thick, taut rope that acted as the main suspension anchor for that side of the bridge, bolted into the rock of the canyon wall. He fired. The rifle's report was a single, sharp crack that seemed to silence all other noise. The bullet did not strike flesh. It struck the iron bolt holding the rope. The metal shrieked, splintered, and the rope, under the immense tension of the bridge's weight, snapped with a sound like a cannon shot. The bridge did not collapse. It swung, violently, like a gate. One side suddenly untethered. The laws of physics took over. Avery, standing near the unmoored edge, was thrown off his feet. He screamed, a high, thin sound of pure terror. As he was catapulted sideways, his grip on Eliza broken. He tumbled through the air and hit the churning water below with a heavy splash. He was not dead. He surfaced, sputtering and flailing, his pistol gone. his power washed away by the current as he was swept downstream. As soon as the shot was fired, before the bridge had even settled, the thunder of hoofbeats sounded from the end of the street. A dozen riders, led by the county marshal, a grim-faced man with a shotgun resting on his saddle, galloped into town. The telegraph had done its work. They took in the scene at a glance: the burning building, the dazed townspeople, the broken bridge, and Nantan, still with the rifle at his shoulder. Judge Hale emerged from the hotel, his face a thundercloud. "Arrest him?" the judge said, pointing not at Nantan, but at Pike, who stood frozen on the hotel balcony, his face a mask of disbelief. "And find his deputy." They found Cole Avery a half-mile downstream, clinging to a log, a sputtering, half-drowned man stripped of all his authority. They pulled him from the water and bound his hands. The marshal, acting on the judge's authority, went directly to Pike's office. It did not take him long to find the false bottom in the filing cabinet, and beneath it, the secret ledger, its neat columns detailing a vast and illegal enterprise. The fire was eventually brought under control, reduced to a smoldering, steaming ruin. The immediate danger was over. In the quiet aftermath, Nantan walked onto the tilting, broken bridge where Eliza stood, her body trembling with reaction. He did not touch her. He simply stood beside her, his presence a silent, unwavering certainty. The technology of her world and the ancient skills of his had met on this broken span of wood, and together they had brought a fragile, violent justice to Garnet Ridge. The dust settled. After the fury of the fire and the flood, a quiet descended upon Garnet Ridge, the quiet of a fever that has finally broken. The rain had washed the air clean, and the sky was a high, piercing blue. The burned-out shell of the mine depot stood as a black, skeletal monument to the greed that had nearly consumed the town. It was a scar, but the land around it felt cleansed. The trial of Pike and Cole Avery was a somber, methodical affair, held not in a proper courthouse, but in the saloon, which had been cleared of its whiskey barrels and poker tables. Judge Hale presided with a grim, unwavering authority. The secret ledger, rescued from the marshal's diligence, told an undeniable story of theft and conspiracy. Pike, stripped of his expensive suit and his arrogance, seemed to shrink, becoming a small, pallid man whose blustering denials fell flat in the quiet room. Cole Avery, his face still bruised from his journey down the arroyo, was a caged animal, his eyes darting, looking for an escape that did not exist. The most powerful testimony came from the miners Nantan had pulled from the fire, one by one. These rough, unlettered men stood and pointed a grimy finger not at the Apache warrior, but at the deputy who had stood and watched them nearly burn. "He saved my life," one of them said, his voice thick with emotion as he looked at Nantan. "That man in the uniform, he would have let us all die." The sentiment rippled through the onlookers, a quiet, powerful current of shifting allegiance. The town's prejudice, a thing of rumor and fear, could not stand against the simple, observable truth of a life saved. The final witness was Thomas Whitford. He walked to the front of the room, his face pale, but his gaze steady. He did not look at Pike or Avery. He looked at his sister. When he spoke, his voice was low, but every person in the room heard him clearly. "I lied," he said. "I was asked to bear false witness against Nantan, and I did it. I told everyone he led an attack that never happened. I did it out of fear, and out of shame for a debt I could not pay." He finally looked at Judge Hale. "My testimony was false. Nantan is an innocent man." The confession hung in the air, a stark and simple truth. Eliza felt a pang of sorrow for her brother's weakness, but it was overshadowed by a surge of pride in his courage. He had, at last, chosen the right path. Judge Hale's verdict was swift and certain. Pike and Avery were found guilty, sentenced to long terms in the territorial prison at Yuma. The bandits who had survived the flood were already on their way there. For his perjury, Thomas was given a sentence, But the judge, citing his heroism at the fire and his voluntary confession, suspended the majority of it, sentencing him to a year of public service, helping to rebuild what his cowardice had nearly helped destroy. Justice in Garnet Ridge was not just about punishment, it was about restoration. In the days that followed, a subtle but profound change came over the town. The averted glances and whispers that had followed Eliza for weeks began to fade. People nodded to her on the street. A few even managed a hesitant smile. The fear of the Apache had been replaced by a grudging respect for the man who had faced down fire and flood to save their own. It was Martha Webb who cemented the fragile peace. A week after the trial, she organized a town meal in the open space in front of the livery stable. It was not a celebration, but a gathering. She roasted a steer and put out long trestle tables laden with cornbread, beans, and fresh buttermilk from her dairy. She personally invited Nantan and a delegation from the Red Mesa, including Naichi and the wise old Dane. The gathering was awkward at first. The townspeople clustered on one side, the Apache on the other, a wide gulf of silence and uncertainty between them. Then one of the miners, the first man Nantan had pulled from the bunkhouse, walked across the divide. He held a tin plate heaped with food. He stopped in front of Nantan and wordlessly offered him the plate. Nantan took it with a solemn nod. The miner nodded back and walked away. It was a small gesture, but it was a beginning. A bridge had been crossed. Amidst this quiet healing, Eliza and Nantan had to face the difficult truth of their own future. One afternoon, they walked together on the trail that led from the town toward the foothills, the space that was neither her world nor his. "I have been offered a permanent position," she said, her eyes on the vast expanse of the prairie. "Mr. Croft is retiring. The Territorial Telegraph Company wants me to be the new station agent for Garnet Ridge." "It is good work," he said. "You have a skill, a voice that travels on the wind." "It is a life," she said quietly. "A purpose. I cannot leave it. The wire is my connection to the world, to a life I have built from nothing." She stopped and turned to him. "I cannot live on the Red Mesa. Nantan, I would not know how. I would be a stranger, a curiosity. I would lose myself." He stopped as well, his gaze moving to the high, distant peaks of the mesa, a silent, powerful presence on the horizon. "My roots are in that mountain," he said, his voice soft but unyielding. "They go down through the stone, through the memory of my ancestors. My people are there. Dane grows frail. Naichi needs counsel. To live in your town, among the wooden walls, would be to cut my roots. I would wither." The dilemma stood between them, as vast and uncrossable as a canyon. Their two lives, their two worlds, were fundamentally different. Love could build a bridge, but it could not move a mountain, nor could it reroute the telegraph wire. The silence that fell between them was not one of anger, but of a deep, shared sorrow. "I will not ask you to leave your mountain," she said finally, her voice thick with unshed tears. "And I will not ask you to silence your wire," he replied. It seemed an impossible impasse, an ending before they had truly had a beginning. They stood there for a long time as the sun began to dip, the reality of their situation a heavy weight. Then Nantan looked not at the town or at the mountain, but at the space in between, at the small, abandoned way station where the stagecoach used to change horses before the new road was built. "A bridge does not need to span the entire canyon in one leap," he said, thinking aloud. "Sometimes it rests on a pillar in the middle." Eliza followed his gaze, and an idea, fragile and new, began to form. "The way station," she said, her voice filled with a sudden, dawning hope. "It is on the main trail. The mail riders pass it every day. The new survey lines for the telegraph run right beside it." "It is not the town," he said, "and it is not the mesa. It is between—" The plan unfolded between them, a collaborative design for a new kind of life, a new, smaller telegraph and post office, not in the heart of Garnet Ridge, but here, at the crossroads, a neutral ground. Eliza would be the agent. Her connection to the world maintained. She would be a vital link for the entire region, a respected figure who belonged not to the town, but to the territory. And Nantan, his skills as a guide and scout now in demand by the mail service and the survey crews, would have an official, honorable position. He would be paid for his knowledge, for his ability to read the land. He would not be a scout for the army, forced to betray his own people, but a guide for progress, a man who could lead others safely through the wilderness he called home. He would live at the station with Eliza, but the Red Mesa would be a short ride away, his roots still firmly in the earth of his ancestors. It was a compromise, a life built not on the terms of one world or the other, but on the creation of a new one, a small, independent island of their own making. The small station would be their home. It would be a symbol of their future, a place of connection, a bridge built of love, respect, and a stubborn refusal to be defined by the divisions of the past. They would be a family of their own choosing, a quiet testament to the possibility of a shared existence in a land that was still learning how to live with itself. The old stagecoach way station was a skeleton, picked clean by the wind and sun, but in the weeks that followed the trial, it was resurrected, bone by bone. Thomas, his face set with a quiet determination, worked with a tireless energy, his public service becoming a private penance. He squared the stone walls, planed new timbers for the roof, and set panes of glass in the empty window frames. He was joined by two of the miners Nantan had saved, men who offered their labor not for pay, but for something closer to grace. Martha Webb brought them lunch each day, her presence a steady, encouraging warmth from the high mesa. Nantan would watch the new building rise, a small, solitary outpost of hope in the vast landscape. Their wedding day dawned clear and bright, the sky a vast, clean slate. They did not choose the town, nor the Apache camp, but a place in between, a flat stretch of prairie where the grama grass was the color of honey and the red mesa stood as a silent, eternal witness. There was no church, no altar, only the earth and the sky. The congregation was a small, improbable gathering, a testament to the bridges that had been built. Martha was there, her face beaming. Thomas stood beside his sister, his past shame replaced by a quiet dignity. Judge Hale had ridden out, not as a magistrate, but as a friend. From the other direction came Nietzsche and Danae, followed by a small, solemn group of their people. The miners came too, their hats held awkwardly in their hands, their faces scrubbed clean. There were two ceremonies, intertwined like threads in a single, strong cord. First, Danae stepped forward. The old woman's voice was as thin as a dry leaf, yet it carried on the breeze. Speaking in the Apache tongue, she was not praying to a distant god. She was speaking to the land, to the spirits of the place, and to the two people who stood before her. She spoke of the mountain that endures, of the water that gives life, of the sky that shelters all. She spoke of partnership, of walking side by side, each supporting the other, neither leading, neither following. Nantan and Eliza held hands, and though Eliza did not understand the words, she understood the meaning. It was a vow to the earth, to each other, a promise to be a shelter, to be a source of strength. Then Judge Hale stepped forward, his law book held in his hand. He kept it brief, his voice stripped of legal formality, warm with a genuine affection. He spoke of the law of the land, but also of the law of the heart. He spoke of the courage it takes to build a home, to forge a family in a hard country. In the eyes of the territory and by the witness of this community, he said, "You are joined." He did not ask them to kiss. He simply told them to shake hands. A simple, solid gesture of a bargain struck, a partnership sealed. After the formal words were spoken, the true covenants were exchanged. Danae came to Eliza. In her hands, she held a necklace of olivella shells, small, spiraled shells that had been traded across these lands for 1,000 years, each one a tiny, perfect piece of a world far from this desert. They were cool against Eliza's skin, as the old woman placed them around her neck. It was a gift of acceptance, a symbol that tied her not just to a man, but to a people, to a history written in stone and shell. Then Eliza turned to Nantan. In her hand, she held a small, brass telegraph key, polished until it gleamed. It was mounted on a small piece of dark wood, with a leather thong tied to it. It was not a tool for him to use, but a symbol for him to carry. It was her voice, her power, her connection to the world she came from. In giving it to him, she was giving him her trust. He took it and slung the thong around his neck, the small, intricate piece of machinery resting against his buckskin shirt. It was a strange and beautiful contrast, the language of the wire resting beside the heart of the wilderness. In the months that followed, the way station became the new heart of the territory. The telegraph wire, strung on new poles that marched across the prairie, hummed with life. Eliza's hand was the one that translated the dots and dashes, turning electrical impulses into news of births and deaths, of cattle prices and railroad surveys. She was the center of a new web of communication, her small office a vital link in the chain of a growing nation. Nantan became a respected figure in his own right, his skills finally valued for what they were. He guided the mail riders through treacherous weather, led the survey crews through impassable canyons, and taught newcomers the difference between a plant that would nourish and one that would not. He was paid a fair wage, money he used to buy blankets and supplies for his people on the mesa. He moved between two worlds, a bridge of a man, losing the respect of neither. One quiet evening, as twilight settled in a soft, purple haze over the plains, Eliza sat at her desk, writing a letter. The telegraph sounder was quiet, and the only sound was the scratch of her pen on the paper and the gentle sigh of the wind outside. She was writing to a distant cousin in Missouri, the last living link to the world she had left behind. She wrote, "I came to this land seeking my brother, and I have found him. He is a good man who is healing from a difficult time. I came seeking a future, and I have found one, though it is not the one I could have ever imagined. The dust here is red, and the sun is a fierce and unforgiving thing. There is a hardness to this country that gets into your bones, but there is a beauty too, a stark and terrible beauty that strips you down to who you truly are. I have learned that justice is not always found in a courtroom. Sometimes it is found in the courage of ordinary people who refuse to believe a lie. I have learned that a family is not always the one you are born into. Sometimes it is a shelter you build with others, a small circle of trust in a wide and lonely world. And I have learned that love is not what the poets write about. It is a quiet, sturdy thing, built of respect and 1,000 small acts of kindness. It is a promise that is warmer than a fire on a cold night. I have married a man of this land. He is a Chiricahua warrior, a man of silence and strength. He does not speak of his heart, but he shows it in his deeds. He is my anchor, my shelter, and my home. Our life is here, in a small stone house between the town and the mountain. The telegraph wire sings outside my window. Sometimes, I think it is the new heartbeat of this land, a pulse of progress and hope. Every click and clatter is a word, a connection, a promise that we are no longer alone." Nantan came in as she was finishing, his moccasins silent on the wooden floor. He placed a hand on her shoulder and looked out the window with her. His gaze was fixed on the distant, jagged line of mountains to the east. "A surveyor I guided today spoke of a new rumor. He said," his voice a low rumble, "they mean to put the railroad through Canyon Diablo." Eliza looked out at the darkening horizon. Canyon Diablo. It was a wild, difficult place. A railroad would bring thousands of new men, new problems, a new kind of greed. The peace they had found was a fragile thing. The world was not done with them yet. Another storm was gathering, far in the distance. She felt a familiar flicker of fear, but it was quickly replaced by something else. She leaned into his touch, her shoulder pressing against his side. She looked at their home, this bridge they had built. She thought of Thomas and Martha, and the miners who now nodded to her husband in the street. Their foundation was strong. It was built of stone and truth and hard-won trust. Whatever came next, they would face it together. Thank you for listening to our story. We would love for you to comment where you are listening from so we can all connect and share our thoughts. And we invite you to subscribe to our channel Wild West Tales, like the video, and support us further by pressing the hype button so this story in the video can be heard by more people.